Hi everybody, very welcome to Mentour and yet another video podcast. As always, I hope you're doing absolutely fantastic. Today on the video, guys, we're going to be talking about runway excursions. That's when an aircraft lands and finds out that it has too little runway left and goes off the end of the runway. Why does this happen? I'm going to give you 3 different phases of flight with the pilots that need to pay close attention in order to make sure that landing is successful. And at the end, there will be a quiz at mentorpilot.com, so make sure that you stay focused.
Wind 31016, turn right, turn right. Third line, 31 right. Delta 260.
This video is brought to you in cooperation with our long-term sponsor, Brilliant.org. Now, as you learn in this episode, when we talk about dissipating energy or Aqua planning calculation, you really have to understand maths and physics in order to understand these concepts. Brilliant.org is a fantastic tool in order to help you do that in a fun and interactive way. The 501st of you who uses this link here below will get a whopping 20% off the annual fee of Brilliant, and it's completely free to go and check it out, so do that. Right guys, runway excursions. As you've seen in quite well publicized cases during the last year or so, runway excursions continue to happen. Only in the beginning of May there was a Miami Air Boeing 737-800 that went off the runway and into a river in Jacksonville, Florida during quite bad weather. So when we look at the industry, almost all types of accidents are decreasing, but runway excursions are actually staying the same or even increasing. Why is that? So, in order to understand this, you need to understand what the pilots are doing prior to going in for the approach. You need to understand how we need to look at the landing, and also what kind of human behavior might be behind the fact that these things keep happening. So, first of all, planning. The most important thing in any type of flying situation is to be properly prepared for the situation. Okay, and in the case of a landing, we actually spend quite a lot of time to prepare. So even before we leave the crew room, even before we start flying, we will have done what's called a dispatch landing calculation. This is really important, especially when you're flying to shorter runways or when you're flying into runways which are expected to be contaminated, maybe with snow, ice or standing water. And what we do basically is we use our operational performance tool. We have it in our iPads, but you can also do it just by using the performance manual of your aircraft. That kind of calculation, what we do is we input all of the parameters that we think will exist on the time of landing. So what kind of runway state will it be? Is it going to be wet, dry, contaminated? What's the temperature? What's the wind? What's runway length? Things like that. We put that in and we will come up with a maximum weight, a maximum landing weight. And we just compare that with the kind of landing weight that we're expecting. Now the dispatch performance calculation that we do have a safety margin of 60% in it. So basically it takes whatever landing distance that we need times 1.67%, times 1.67 and make sure that we can do that. So it gives a little bit of a security margin already. And on top of that, if the runway is wet, it puts another 15% in. Okay. Most of the time, that's not limiting, especially if we're going into dry runways or long runways. We're always going to come up with a maximum landing weight. But it still has to be done, because if you have things like, for example, something wrong with the aircraft, let's say that you have the anti-skid system not operative, or some other things, flight spoilers not working, hydraulic problems. In that case, it might be limiting. So we have to do that. It's a legal requirement that this is done prior to flight. Well, then we go out, get our aircraft, we will get our flying towards our destination. And then as we start setting up for the approach, the pilot flying starts preparing for the approach. Part of that is to do another performance calculation. In this case, it's an actual landing performance calculation. This means that now there's no factors built in Now, this is what you will actually end up with. And it's very similar. So we would have taken the weather information from the airport that we're going to, as accurate as possible. We put that into our operation performance tool, and we see exactly what kind of landing distance we have required. This is very important, and the way that this is done is that both pilots have to do individual calculations. So the first officer does one, I do one, then we compare and we make sure that we can actually land. Now, this is done maybe half an hour before the landing. So this means that if there is, for example, a rain shower that comes in, the conditions on the ground might actually be really different from when we do this calculation to when we actually land. And here comes my first point to you guys. If that's the case, go in, recalculate. Okay, take the time to do the recalculation, because it might save you from one of these runway excursions. So preparation is absolutely key. Now, the landing phase is divided into 3 different phases, and all of these 3 phases have their different threats associated to them, and they have to be taken seriously. So, first phase is the actual approach phase. Okay? During the approach phase, this is where most of the runway excursions actually start, because we have to make sure that the aircraft is fully stabilized before we go in and execute any landing. And this might sound like, duh, of course you need to, but in fact, many things can happen. You might get an unexpected shortcut, for example, which renders you with a much higher energy level than you were expecting. There might be something distracting you, so you might forget to do the landing checklist or forget to configure the aircraft. In any case, on any approach we do, we need to, if we are in IMC, which is Instrument Meteorological Conditions, we need to be stabilized at 1,000 feet. If we are in Visual Meteorological Conditions, so VMC, we need to be stabilized by 500 feet. And 500 feet is the absolute latest point. By stabilized, I mean that the aircraft needs to be in a good position to land. It needs to have proper speed within, normally plus about 15 knots down to the ref speed, which is the landing speed. It needs to be in the correct altitude, so we cannot be very high or very low. Generally, if we're flying an instrument landing system, that means within 1 dot localizer or glide slope deflection. We need to be fully configured. So at 500 feet, the landing flap should be up. We should be back to our landing speed. Like I said, plus maybe 15 to 20 knots if that's an absolute maximum. But the thrust needs to be up. So we need to be on approach thrust, which tends to be between 45 to about 65%. All of this, together with the landing checks is complete, has to be done. And that's because if we're not, it's likely that if you're not stabilized at 500 feet, you will probably not be stabilized when you get in for the landing. And it means that you'll be carrying more or less energy than you should be. And it's not a controlled environment. And we want to have the approach controlled, latest from 500 feet. Okay? The pilot monitoring plays a crucial role here, because the pilot flying tends to be very goal-oriented. Like, we see a runway, we want to land there. So it's likely that even if one of these parameters are not fully stabilized, we might still push on to try to go in for this landing. And this is where the pilot monitoring has to come in at 500 feet latest and say, 500 feet, not stabilized, go around. And we just do a go-around. Now, if you want to see how a go-around is done, I did a video on that just 2 weeks ago. So go on and check out the link here about how a go-around is to be done. And remember that all good airlines have a no-blame policy for go-around. This means that for whatever reason, if you choose to go around is always the safest option. Do that and go in and do a nice stabilized approach. Much better than coming in unstabilized and trying to land. So that was phase 1. The approach phase. Phase 2 is the flare. So when we go in for the landing, the way that this OPT has calculated landing distance is that we pass the threshold of the runway at 50 feet. We should pass it at 50 feet with a VREF plus 5, more or less. And then during the flare down to touchdown, we dissipate those last 5 knots and we'll touch down with VREF. The air distance which is included in the landing distance that we've calculated, tends to be about 1,000 feet, which is about 305 meters. Okay. The flare in the 737-800 starts roughly at around 30 feet. So around 30 feet, we start to pull a little bit back on the yoke. What we're doing is we're arresting the descent rate. So this is different from flying, for example, a Cessna, where in a Cessna you actually stall out the aircraft. A 737 you don't stall out. You basically fly the aircraft into the runway in a controlled way. So during the approach we would have come in with about 750 feet per minute, and we would touch down would be maybe 100 to 200 feet per minute or so, which is still a firm touchdown, but it is a controlled landing. So nice arrest descent rate from 30 feet down, close to thrust levels to make sure that in a perfect world, as the thrust levels are closed, you touch down at the same time, right? This is the way that a flare is supposed to be done. But there are threats here as well. If you weren't stabilized during the approach, you might end up coming in a little bit too high. If you come up twice as high, as in 100 feet of the threshold instead of 50 feet, you are going to add 300 meters to the landing distance. For every knot that you come in quicker than expected, you add about 2%. So 10 knots higher speed would give about 20% longer landing distance. So it's really, really important that you pay attention to this and that you do a proper flare. If you overflare, you flare too much, it means that the aircraft will be floating down the runway, and it eats an enormous amount of runway when it does this. Okay, so at too much flare, the aircraft will not touch down where it's supposed to. It will continue to float down the runway, and you will lose a lot of landing distance. This is when you do those really soft landings that all of the passengers in back are giving you a round of applause, but the pilots are actually kind of beating themselves up because that's not what they wanted. On the other hand, if you don't do enough flare, so let's say that you start the flare too late or you flare too little, what you might end up doing is a quite hard landing, and that can render you into a bounced landing. A bounced landing, if you bounce too high, go around. Right? You're not going to be able to come back from that. You might actually tail strike the aircraft if you try. If you do a soft bounce, a very shallow bounce, you might be able to continue the landing from that. But remember, that wasn't included in your landing distance. So if you're landing on a very short runway, it might actually be better to go around. And you can go around from any point until the thrust reversers have been selected. All right. This is why step 2 is the flare. Step 3 is the landing rollout. This part is crucial, and here, in combination with unstabilized approaches, mistakes in the landing roll is where most runway excursions are actually formed. So what we do during the landing roll then? Well, we have to professionally and effectively use all our braking devices. So they include speed brakes. Those are the spoilers that comes up on the wings. So you've all seen them when you've landed, that the spoilers comes up. There are thrust reversers, and it's the auto brake system. So the auto brake system we would have already calculated in our OPT when we did our performance calculation, which auto brake we want to use. Speed brake, hugely important. I cannot overemphasize this. All right, this is why there is a call out from the pilot monitoring when we land, which is speed brake up or speed brake not up.
Speed brakes up.
The importance of the speed brake is that when we land and the speed brake system feels that we have roll up on the tires and that we have weight on wheel switch activation, it will extend the flight spoilers to ground spoiler activation, okay, to ground mode. This will essentially destroy the lift on the wings. And what happens then is that the aircraft full weights down on the main gear, which gives the most effective braking. If you forget the speed brake, if the speed brake hasn't been armed for landing or it doesn't work, well then the aircraft will basically partially continue to fly on the runway. So it will take off a lot of weight from the brakes, and the anti-skid system is going to activate. So you're not going to get the braking that you have been calculated on when you did the performance calculation. So to get the speed brake up, really important. Okay. Next, thrust reverses. Thrust reverses are important for two different reasons. If you're landing on a dry runway, the thrust reversers will help to dissipate the energy from the brakes. It will not reduce the landing distance, but it will reduce the amount of energy that the brakes takes out, and that will reduce the temperature of the brakes, which will be important for the subsequent turnaround and potentially rejected takeoff in the next takeoff. Okay. But if you're landing on a wet runway or a flooded runway, the thrust reversers might be the only thing that actually is stopping you. And here's where I wanted to get into aqua planning. Okay, because some of the runway excursions that we've seen lately has happened during or just after a severe storm has passed the airport. The thing with that is that the runways are built to dissipate the rain, and they're built like a U, like this, to make sure that when the rain falls, it just they kind of flows off the sides and, you know, keeps the runways relatively clear. But it takes a while for all that water to disappear. We sometimes use grooved runways for that. That's little like grooves in the runway that leads the water off. But if that doesn't happen, there is a possibility that a small layer of water might still be on the runway. Now, if you land on that, providing that you have the tires properly pumped up to the right tire pressure, and you have the tires well grooved so that they can dissipate a little bit. Even if you have that, you might still start to build up kind of a wave of water in front of the tires. And when there's enough water, that water will actually lift the tires off the ground. And no matter how much you're braking, then you're basically water skiing down the runway, and you have nil braking action. Okay, there is a way to calculate this. There's a way to calculate your aquaplaning speed, and it is 9 times the square root of the tire pressure. So if the tire pressure, for example, is 64 psi, square root of 64 is 8, and 9 times 8 is 72. So that will be 72 knots is the aquaplaning speed if you're coming in and landing with, on a flooded runway. So you need to have less speed than that in order for the tires to actually break through the water and hit the asphalt and start braking, right? And this is where the thrust reversers are so important, guys, because the thrust reversers will work even if you're aquaplaning. They will still redirect the bypass air forward and make sure that you get a little bit of braking. And subsequently as well, if you're landing on a ice runway or slush on the runway, snow, some kind of contamination, the worse braking action it is, the more important the thrust reversers are. So the way to do this is that as you land, main gear touchdown, thrust reversers unlocked. Nose gear touchdown, you have already selected it to the first interlock, which gives you about 73% of reverse thrust. And you can use all the way up to the max detent, which is 82% N1. That you can use all the way down until the aircraft is stopped. On a dry runway or where the braking action is good, we start to reduce the reverse thrust at around 80 knots down to idle at about 60. But you do not, and I really want to emphasize this, do not cancel the reverse thrust until stopping is assured. So on a wet runway or contaminated runway of any sort, sit with the thrust reversers available to you, because you don't know when the braking action might go from quite good to poor. Let's say that they have been clearing the runway, but they haven't cleared the end of the runway very well. But then all of a sudden, because you're sitting there with wheel brakes on, the anti-skid jumps in, you don't have brakes anymore, you have to have the reversers available. Because if you have actually cancelled them, you're going to have to reinitiate the entire sequence of extending them. That means that the locks have to be disengaged, the hydraulics have to activate the reverser sleeves, they have to come into position, and then you have to spool up the engines in order to get reverse thrust back in. You might end up, facing the end of the runway, reselecting reversers and not having enough time to actually activate them before you go off the end of the runway. So remember, the thrust reversers can be used up to maximum reverse thrust at any speed. Do not cancel them until stopping is assured. Okay? So those are the 3 different phases: the approach, make sure that you're stabilized. Make sure if you're pilot monitoring that you call a go around if it's needed. The flare, make sure the flare is done correctly. You don't flare too late and bounce the aircraft, or too early and float the aircraft down the runway. We spend a lot of time in the line training of new pilots to make sure that we get this absolutely correct. The landing rollout. Make sure you use all of the available stopping devices. So the auto brakes, according to what you have calculated before the landing. Speed brakes activated to dump the lift and get the full braking out of the brakes. And the thrust reversers as needed. Okay, very, very important. And that brings me to the conclusion. Why do I think that these runway excursions continue to happen and even increase? Well, the fact here is that I think that this is largely down to the human factor. This is up to you and me as pilots to make sure that we don't put ourselves in positions where we might end up with the runway excursions. We have to understand that we should be really conservative when it comes to the runway states. And I think that maybe sometimes we're a little bit overconfident. We're coming into the summer now. That means that down here in southern Europe, we're going to have loads of these thunderstorms that are everywhere. The same in the United States and all over Asia. Remember that if you're coming into land at the runway and there's been a CB that's passed by and a heavy rain shower, either ask the airport to go out and do a runway assessment to see if there's actually standing water still on the runway, or just go into the hold, make one more orbit, let the water dissipate off the runway before you come in. Because what you really don't want is to end up on the runway trying to brake, realizing that you're aquaplaning, not having enough runway left and ending up in the river. Okay? We are very goal-oriented as pilots. We tend to look at what is the schedule. Are we going to get there on time? What is this going to affect our next flight? And if we see a runway and we see that a CB has passed by, there's nothing on the weather radar anymore, it's very likely that we might go in, and shoot the approach. But there still might be standing water on the runway. And this is where we have to get better. We have to make sure to give that little extra time to let the runway condition be at least as good as what we had calculated, and if not, we need to do a new calculation based on standing water that might be braking action medium to poor and still have enough runway to land. Otherwise, it's much better to sit there in the hold and burn another 5 minutes off the schedule. Okay? Cool. Now, as you've noticed throughout this episode, we've been talking about things like dissipating energy levels and calculating aquaplaning speeds. All of this is maths and physics, and these are the kind of maths and physics that you will come across every single day in this occupation. And this is why I am so happy to have Brilliant.org as a sponsor to this episode. Because I know that Brilliant.org is a very, very good tool for people, if you are like me, who didn't really appreciate the maths and physics we did in school, but still understood that you need to understand it in order to be successful in your chosen occupation. They will give you things like daily challenges where you can go in and try to solve a problem that they're giving to you. And if you can't solve it, they will give you the tools in order to do so. They have courses like Physics of Everyday, for example, where there actually is a course relating to what we've done today, where you get to investigate car accident based on, for example, the brake skid marks after the car. So those of you, the 500 of you who uses this link here below, will get 20% off the annual fee of Brilliant, but it's completely free to check it out. So I advise you to go in and do just that. And now guys, it is quiz time. So once you've seen this whole episode, you go into mentorpilot.com, there will be a quiz about this, and it's a 75% pass mark, just like it will be on your ATPL and your CPL exams, right? Come in afterwards, write in the comments down here how you did on the exam, and also tell me if there's anything else that you want me to explain or talk about, any current events in the aviation industry that you want me to kind of dive a little bit deeper into. Anything. I'm listening to what you guys have to say. And also, of course, Make sure that you've subscribed to the channel and that you have highlighted the notification bell. Otherwise, you might not hear when I do things like live streams, for example, or suddenly have a little bit of time over in the flight deck and I want to show you something. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.